A Shalom Akim Shalom Shalom. Giving all praises, glory and honor to Yahweh Bashim Yahushai. Bashim Makakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders, great millstone for teaching us his truth. And salutations to the sincere Akim and Aquatim. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will is always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I wanted to go through a particular type of offering known as first fruit offerings, and just to get some understanding in regards to how it functioned back in the ancient times, when our people when we were blessed, to essentially enter into the land, during the time of our forefather Joshua. And basically, us having, that abundance, right? The having the abundance, the different crops that we had. And what was this offering for? Because when you go through the book, basically towards the end of the book of Joshua, the different tribes had received their different portions of the land. And but there was one particular tribe that didn't have that didn't receive that, an allotment, which was the tribe of Levi. And they were essentially the Levites. They were they were to be essentially priests, right? And the priests were responsible for performing the sacrifices, and burning incense, what I'm saying. And this was a very particular job, so they were pretty much devoted to this particular position. But they were taken care of, right? And I wanted to show the parallels between what happened back then, is can still apply now, right? Because even though we're not in our land, although we're not, have those the abundance of resources and so on and so forth, you can still use the resources, that the Lord would have blessed you with, to be able to still offer up a sacrifice, right? Because we know, pursuant to Romans, we are the sacrifice, right? And I wanted to just flow back and forth with this idea, and basically how your sacrifice can still benefit not only yourself in a time of trouble, but also it can also benefit the priest. It can also benefit the Lord's prophets, right? Because we talk about, like, all these calamities that are on the planet, that are coming, like, for example, like famine, famine of the word. We talk about in scriptures talk about how spirits are created for vengeance, wars and rumors of wars, right? So this is basically just an idea of something to kind of keep, something to keep in mind, to essentially offer up, a sweet smelling sacrifice unto the Lord. If you're blessed to actually have some, it could be some physical substance, but it could also, what I'm saying, to if you have the means to do so, to take care, of the Lord's men, his apostles, the apostles, the prophets, and so on and so forth, by all means, do so, because the scriptures talk about, as a matter of fact, let me get it in Sirach. And then I'll get into the lesson, really. This is Sirach chapter 12, or Ecclesiasticus, chapter 12, verse 1, and it says, "When thou wilt do good, to know whom thou doest it, and so shalt thou be thanked for thy benefits." Right? So knowing basically, who you do good to, right? And a good example of that, was, a good example basically was Abigail, when you go into David's story, because David, and especially his men, they were pretty much in a time of trouble, right? Not necessarily in the time of trouble, but they were in need of some substance, right? But because he was being sought after by King Saul, right? But her doing what she did, making haste and giving David and his men some substance, right? Being able to be a help unto him, essentially, the Lord had mercy upon her, right? But it says in verse 2, it says, do good to the godly man, and thou shalt find a recompense, and if not from him, yet from the Most High Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. Right? So let me get into a little bit of the lesson in regards to first fruit offerings. And I sincerely pray that this lesson, is edifying, right? So this is just to get an understanding of what it was. This is first fruit offerings. This is Deuteronomy 26. Start at verse 1 here, and I'll read down to verse 4. And it says here, and it shall be when thou art come into the land, which the Lord Yahweh thy power giveth thee for an inheritance, and possesses it, and thou dwellest therein, then thou shalt take the first of all the fruit of all the earth, which thou shalt bring thy land, which the Lord thy power Yahweh giveth thee, and put it in a basket, and thou shalt go into the place of the Lord thy power shall choose to place his name there. And thou shalt go unto the priest, and that shall be in those days, and say unto him, I profess this day unto the Lord thy power, I am come into the country which the Lord Yahweh sware unto our fathers for to give us. And the priest shall take the basket out of thine hand and set it down before the altar of thy power, right? So, when we had the substance back then, we were supposed to take, these particular fruits, the first of all, the fruit of all the earth, and give it unto the Lord, right? And then the priest would take it, and then they would make use of it, right? Because it was basically like a mindset of the Lord blessed us with all this abundance, so essentially we were giving it back. And the Lord thought this out, so cold, like so through so well out to the T, because going back to the point I was making earlier, the priest had a specific type of job, right? So they didn't have that physical allotment in regards to the land, right? So essentially, okay, so because that's how we lived off of back in the ancient times. In the ancient times, it's not like in the mindset we have today, where we go to your local supermarket for everything. That wasn't the thing. You either had an abundance of sheep, goats, cattle. You had a plethora of different trees that were growing, all these trees that are bearing fruit, that are bearing seeds, right? You had a lot of the substance that you needed, to essentially continue your livelihood. It wasn't, we lived a very, very agrarian agricultural type of society. It wasn't like the type of society like we live in, now, right? Where everything is all about so-called convenience. But when you think about it as well, in the pursuit for all this convenience, all these skills, we lost, right? So we don't really have a lot of the farming skills or the shepherding skills or anything like that, or even the skills to shear sheep and wool and stuff like that. We don't have a lot of these skills anymore. But nevertheless, that was pretty much, the point. And what did the priest do with this, right? So I wanted to read this as well, because I wanted to just I'm making a long-winded point, but Lord's will, this would piece together and make sense, so you can see the benefits of doing good unto ultimately in this time, for yourself to offer up a pleasant sacrifice and as well as doing good to a godly man, doing good to a man of the Lord, doing good to a prophet, a priest. You know what I'm saying? In these times, right? Taking advantage of those opportunities. You know what I'm saying? To essentially store up your treasures in heaven, right? Because we understand that we live in a society where they're going towards a digital, system, and that is essentially leading to, their MOTB, so you can use whatever substance that it is you have, to essentially help, a godly man in need, right? So I wanted to get this here. So this is Numbers chapter 18, verse 8. And I'll read it in the NLT and I'll read down. And it says, "And the Lord Yahweh gave these further instructions to Aaron." And it says, "I myself put you, in charge of all the holy offerings that are brought out to me by the people of Israel. And I have given all these consecrated offerings to you and your sons as your permanent share. You are allotted the portion of the most holy offerings that is not burnt on the fire," right? So there were certain offerings that were basically, that would be burnt on the fire. Like, so for example, you had burnt offerings, because the burnt offering basically was like, this particular one where it was like the animal would be consumed completely by fire. And then you had other offerings, like for example, if you go into Leviticus, I think it's the 7th chapter, it goes into peace offerings, right? So a peace offering, which function a little bit differently, right? The priest would basically use the different portions. I believe it was the thigh and the shoulder, and it was that was used to take care of the priest and his household, right? But it would still be offered up as a sacrifice, right? So there were certain sacrifices basically that were offered up, and it wasn't some were used, some utilized fire, and some did not utilize fire, just to clear that, right? So the going back to the point here, it says, "This portion of all of the most holy offerings, including the grain offerings, the sin offerings, the guilt offerings." Sometimes grain offerings, just for context, normally it would normally in the KJV it's referred as meat offerings. So if you see word meat, it's not always referring to actual like steak or a cow or something like that, right? It's normally referring to a grain, right? So it says here, "It will be most holy, and it belongs to you and your sons." Verse 10. And it says, "And you must eat it as a most holy offering. All the males may eat of it, and you must treat it as most holy. All the sacred offerings and the special offerings presented to me when the Israelites lift up them before the altar also belong to you. I have given them to you and your sons and your daughters as your permanent share. Any member of your family who is ceremonially clean may eat of these offerings." So whatever the resources the Israelites brought, these particular offerings, they were allowed to eat of, right? To take care of the priest, and not only the priest, but his family, right? So I'm reading this to show that how much your offering, or how much the offerings of our people back then benefited the livelihood of the priest. Just like how, is, your offering now can still benefit a prophet or a priest, right? A man of the Lord, in a sense. And that's why I read these, because, that's ultimately is to offer up a sweet, a pleasant sacrifice unto the Lord, right? So I'm going to get that later on. And this is verse 12, and it says, "I have given you the harvest gifts brought by your people as offerings to the Lord Yahweh Bashem Yahushai, the best of the oil, new wine, and grain, and the first crops of their land, that they may present it to the Lord, belong to you. Any member of your family who is ceremonially clean may eat of this food," right? So, it was a special portion that was reserved for the priests, and Levites, right? To take care of, because they had the duties, within the tabernacle, right? To be able to perform these duties, they didn't have It's not like they had the time to go and start, you know, taking care of their sheep and their goats and their cattle and all that kind of stuff, right? They will come. Their inheritance was pretty much the Lord when you go into this particular chapter, right? So, with that being said, although we don't have the physical, what's the word I'm looking for? The physical resources, maybe the little resources that you might have now in this time can still be beneficial to actually helping, the men of the Lord, the prophets that are on the highways and byways, because when you go into something that Paul said in regards to diversity of operations, you had helps, right? So if you're a help and you're able to help, you know it's that's very honorable, right? That can be counted towards righteousness. I want to get an example of this particular kind of offering that was done. Just bear with me on this. Let me just find it. Okay, so this is Tobit chapter 1. I'll read verse 1 and I'll jump to 6. And it says, "This is the book of the words of Tobit, the son of Tobiel, the son of Ananiel, the son of Aduel, the son of Gabiel, of the seed of Asahel, of the tribe of Naphtali." So it says in verse 6, "But I alone," this is Tobit speaking, excuse me, "but I alone went to Jerusalem at the feast, as it was ordained unto the people of Israel by an everlasting decree, having the first fruits and tenth of increase of that which was first shorn. And them I gave at the altar to the priests, the children of Aaron." Right. So this was they kept this custom, right? They kept this within their mind. And Tobit was, when you go through his story, he was an upright individual even in the midst of captivity. So how much more in this captivity that we're in, him still offering up a pleasant sacrifice and still walking uprightly in the midst of captivity. Like how much more us in scattered all over the world, primarily a lot of us are in America, right? So it's really about offering up essentially a pleasant sacrifice even in the midst of captivity, right? So, and hopefully the Lord would have mercy upon us within these times, and remember what we did, right? Because when you go through his story, the Lord when he got his eyesight back, right? He all his good deeds were basically brought back, because the angel made it kind of clear, like, oh, when you were burying the dead and so on and so forth, I was with thee, right? So how much more in these times, right? So um so yes, even though we don't actually have the substance, right? The point about the sacrifice still remains, because in this time we are the sacrifice, right? So this is Romans chapter 12 verse 1, right? And it says, hold on. "I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of the Most High, Yahweh Bashim Shai, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto the Most High, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove that what is that good, acceptable, and perfect, and will of the power of Yahweh Bashim Shai," right? So I'm saying, like, this is part of us sacrificing, right? And just the way you're not conformed to the ways essentially of this world, because this world has a mindset of pride. A lot of our people don't actually appreciate the Lord's men. you know if you, and it doesn't really take much to see that, right? All you have to do really is you just go on TikTok, and you see all the kinds of comments that our people have about the Israelites. They don't like the way that the Lord's men speak. They always have a problem. They show is you see essentially you see a lot of our people's rebellion, right? But if you're sincere, right, and you understand that you need to be healed, you understand that you need answers, and you want to be covered, and you want to have mercy upon you have the Lord to have mercy upon you. You know what I'm saying? Like, how much more, this is one of the ways you can do it, right? And giving is not always limited to money. I'll just say it like that, right? Because it can also be um just done in other ways, right? So what I wanted to do, actually, I'm gonna go back here actually to why this giving isn't important as well, because the scriptures say that the end of all things is at hand, right? And charity covereth a multitude of sins. So this is Tobit chapter 4. This is verse 7, and it says, "Give alms of thy substance, and when thou givest alms, let not thine eye be envious, neither turn thy face from any poor, and the face of the Most High shall not be turned away from thee. If thou hast abundance, give alms accordingly. If thou hast but a little, be not afraid to give according to that little." Right? So don't overstress yourself, right? But sometimes you'll be in situations where you might have to help out somebody in particular, right? But this is, I guess, more help to, it's more in the mind frame of, okay, you see apostles, prophets, bishops, teachers teaching, right? Help them. It doesn't take much to help them out. If you're not within that lot of that, a priest or a prophet or a teacher or a bishop or whatever, right? On the front lines like that, if you're like a help, it doesn't take much to actually help, right? Because, like, I'm kind of just explaining this because a lot of our people don't actually appreciate the Lord's word. They don't actually appreciate their labor. They don't appreciate the labor of our apostles and prophets and so on and so forth, right? They rather essentially skin up their face and teeth and gnash their teeth, and what I'm saying, they don't actually show any appreciation, just like they didn't really show appreciation in the wilderness for the manna, right? And they were reminiscing about the leeks and the melons and the fish, and what I'm saying, and then the Lord fed them with quails, and it's just, but the Lord was upset with us, right? Because and our people were just being very ungrateful, basically, right? Let me just continue here, and it says here this is verse 9. Here's really the point. For thou layest up a good treasure for thyself against the day of necessity, right? Because there's going to be a time where we don't have actual access to supermarkets, have access to all the like the abundance that we have. No, I don't want to say abundance, but you know what I mean, like have that kind of abundance, that freedom, I should rather say, to go into supermarkets and so on and so forth, unless you're part of the system, right? So really the point is for the Lord to be able to come through for us in those times of necessity, in those times of trouble and famine and calamities and so on and so forth. Like, how much more in those times, because the scriptures say that riches don't even profit within a day of wrath, but righteousness can deliver from death, right? So let me finish this off here, and it says, verse 10, Tobit chapter 4, and it says, because that alms do deliver from death, and suffer not to come into darkness. For alms is a good gift, and all that give it in the sight of the Most High. Right. So, it's really just about doing good unto the godly men. Right. And again, let me just put this out as a disclaimer. This is not a lesson to I don't want people to think that we're begging. We're begging for offerings and so on and so forth. But if you're galvanized within your spirit to actually try and help in some kind of way, it doesn't have to be money, right? But perform some kind of offerings, just to show a sentiment of gratitude, really, because that's some of the mindset of behind some of these different sacrifices in the ancient times, like the peace offerings or the first fruit offerings, because we were blessed with abundance, we give it back, to show, not to appease, right? Because we understand we sinned, right? Sin is what? Transgression of the law, right? And we understand we're in this condition because, we slipped up, right? So in order to essentially quell a situation, so the Lord will essentially have mercy upon us, we perform and do these particular and try to offer up a pleasing or a sweet smelling sacrifice, right? Us being the sacrifice, right? So the way we, conduct ourselves and so on and so forth, right? So that's pretty much, the point I just wanted to hit, just to show the benefits of what your offering can do for the men of the Lord in these times. But it can also do this for yourself as well, to show that, it can be essentially a heavenly treasure in your spiritual bank account in a day of necessity, right? From all these different calamities, that are falling upon and will fall upon the planet Earth, right? The scriptures say that it is the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. So Lord's will, we are, saved out of this, right? Because we need divine protection. So anyways, I'll leave the lesson there, but Lord's will, this lesson was just quick, edifying, and just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.